You're now live.
Okay, we are live and I have got it that we are being recorded. So this is Senate Finance. This is Friday, January 21st. I'm going to call the meeting to order and we are going to continue our work through the recommendations of the Tax Structure Commission. And Deb Brighton is with us today. And Deb, you had the property tax, ed tax recommendation. So we wanted to get more of an in-depth from you. We've had some 10,000 foot kind of reviews of the recommendations, but I think because this has also come in as part of the weighting study that we look at it, that we take a look. And I think what I'd be interested in is I'm trying to figure out what kind of taxing capacity there is in the upper edges, the upper realms of income, how we determine that, and then what, if any, impact this will proposal have to do on that, because that's the source we've got for other needs. I'm particularly concerned with safety net. So the floor is yours. And if you can help us work through that, it'll be a great day.
Okay, thank you. That was on my list of big questions that we didn't actually resolve, but we did talk about.
Okay.
But I thought I would quickly go through our recommendations with sort of our reasoning behind it and a little bit of our process. And I know Abby has miraculously put the details on it. And so she will follow this with a more precise line by line information. And I also wanted to point out, there were three of us on the commission. The others were Bram Kloppner and Steve Trenholm. And we started out gathering a whole lot of information from a whole lot of people. And then there was COVID. And we didn't have the staff to draw on to do the analysis that we would have done ordinarily. But everybody was sort of, as you know, tied up with the immediate crisis. So we weren't able to try things out, and analyze things and see who was affected by income category and where the changes were, that sort of stuff. And until the task force on weighting asked if the Joint Fiscal Office could get the AGI information to enable us to do that. And so we have just done that. It hasn't been checked. I'd like there to be a second set of eyes at JFO to check it, but we're finally at that point to be able to do a more helpful look at your question.
Okay, so that's to know it's out there means that eventually we can get that as we work our way through all the issues that are out there. Okay, good.
Right. So anyway, as you can imagine, we heard from lots of people who had lots of problems with the current education finance system. And we made a huge long list of all of these problems, issues, and decided that you could try to respond to each one with a tweak. We decided to sort of categorize them, look for structural change to solve as many of the problems that we heard as we possibly could. And so we grouped them and we set some goals or some things we wanted to keep in front of us as we figured out a new system. And so we focused on the house site portion. That was where we heard all of the complaints. So we decided that for the taxpayer, we wanted to have a system that was based on the ability to pay. we wanted a direct tax, not something where you taxed and then had a credit afterwards. We wanted a direct tax. We wanted there to be a clear link for the voters between the budget that they were voting in and their tax bill. We wanted them to be able to have a good idea of what their tax bill was going to be at the school meeting when they voted in the budget. We wanted to get rid of all the caps and cliffs in the current system that are sort of arbitrary and have unintended consequences and even unintended behavioral
Okay,
changes.
Deb, what cliffs? Because we have kind of leveled out. The one cliff I know, and I've tried to get rid of, is the 45,000, where people fall over that edge and they lose $5,000 in tax benefits because they picked up, $500 in income. And
Right.
I was told I couldn't do anything about that. But I wondered what cliffs were you looking at?
Well, so you're talking about what we used to call the rebate program.
Or yeah,
And
the super circuit
So,
breaker. Yeah.
and so
That
that
one.
has a cliff at 47,000. But it actually has intermediate cliffs because we set up these categories, so it's certain percent of your income up to this income level, then you bump into the next category. So there's a little cliff there. It's a clunky way of adjusting for things. So every time you do something like that, you have maybe it's not a cliff, maybe it's cliff can go up or down, I guess.
Yeah,
But
the
anyway,
change.
it's
All
a
right.
sudden change. And then we also have one at $90,000, so that you can pay on income rather than $400,000 of property value up to an income of 90,000. And then all of a sudden that property value amount drops down. So you earn one more dollar and you're paying both on income, plus you're paying 100% of the property tax on any additional house site value that you had more than second cap. So we got letters of people telling us that, they went from $89,000 to $91,000, and they had this huge increase in their tax bill because of that.
Okay. Senator Pearson, you have a question?
Well,
That's appraisal generated.
Senator Pearson?
you're not muted, Senator McDonald. Deb, I just want to make sure I understand that, because there's also some kind of line at 137.5, I think. Maybe I'm thinking household.
Yeah.
But then I think my memory is it's sort of from 90 to 137. There's a hybrid. But what you're describing, I just want to say it again to make sure I have it right. You earn 89,000 1 year in your household. You're paying entirely based on income. You get a $3,000 raise, and you might well lose any benefit of that because you're shifted to paying on your property value. Is that the dynamic? And could you also talk about this window up to 130?
Okay. So let's see, I'll start with the 89,000 to 91,000. So if your house site value is, let's say it's 300,000, and you make $89,000, then you trade your income tax for the entire house site value, because that house site's less than $400,000. Okay. Once you hit 90,000, that house site value drops down to 225. So basically, I forget what I said. I think I said 300,000.
Yeah.
So that difference between 300,000 down to the new cap, you have to pay your property tax on, in addition to paying your income. So suddenly you have your income tax goes up slightly because you earned a little bit more, but then you also have a big chunk of property tax that you have to pay at that point. And so then over 90,000, you just have the choice of paying the property tax on your house value up to that maximum amount in your income. That's the trade-off. And any additional house value, you pay property tax on. So when you get to a certain point of income, your income tax is actually higher than the property tax on that fixed amount. And that's at 137,000, around there, depending on the yield in the different year. So that isn't really a cliff. That's just the end point at which you had any advantage at all of paying on income tax. Okay, after that, your income tax would be higher than the property tax on that limited house site value.
Yeah, you're paying on your property. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So, but
Judge
actually,
McDonald, do you have a question?
What?
Do you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Is it correct that before that, when the original limit in the State Aid Education Bill Act 60 was a $75,000 top limit for being able to pay based on income, that it was in fact a cliff? If you had $1 more than that 75,000, you lost all your income sensitivity. Whereas today, that number is now $90,000, and it's a slope. And the slope is as you described it, Deb Brighton. Is that our history here?
I can't remember the point at which there have been so many changes. I can't remember that point in time. I'm sorry.
I
Trust
think
Senator McDonald, he knows the original
I-
bill.
I believe the chair was the head of the finance committee when that first problem was recognized and the slope was created.
I was
that
here when we
you
did the slope.
Yes. And
I was
you
not
did-
here for birth, but I was here.
No, you corrected the cliff and made it a slope.
Yeah.
And that was perhaps 16 years ago. The other number that I hope the witness will discuss is that 80% of income earners were eligible to participate up until whether it was a slip or a cliff, cliff or a slope, and what's the percentage today? So thank you.
I don't have the percentage today off the top of my head, but it is interesting that with so many of these programs, we haven't tried to index some of these cliff points to income. So that's what happens, is that they sort of lose their effectiveness over time. The $47,000 circuit breaker predates Act 60.
Yes.
35 years old, maybe 40.
Yeah. So I'm clearly there are fewer people in that category now, but also that same category of need isn't
It's
being
just gone
addressed.
up. It used to be 35 and it's now up to apparently 47. Last time I looked, it was 45. So it has been raised, but again, income, house values, expenses have all been going up, and house values do tend to be somewhat cyclical. We are now at a high, but it too shall come down. So through all of this, we're trying to find, as we started, and when we started, I was at the local level, you had a lot of people, older people on fixed incomes who owned homes and they could not afford the property tax on their fixed income. And as property values rose in certain communities, that became more acute. And we've been trying to deal with that. Owning property used to reflect your wealth. Society and the economy has changed, and it does not necessarily reflect your wealth unless you bought a home recently. Then we assume you had to have the money to pay for it. But for anyone that's owned homes any amount of time, the value of your property has frequently gone up much more quickly than your income. And so I think and we've been trying to move that curve so that people are not forced out of their homes. And we know now that we don't have any homes for them to go to. And but yes, and then there's been the little struggle with the other body where the Senate has been the group that has pushed for raising those extensions. And it's clunky. The entire thing is clunky, but it does do what Brigham asked us to do. So
Right.
we'll see what the alternative proposal is. If it's less clunky and meets Brigham.
Okay, so the other sort of our goals that we wanted in terms of the dealing with the taxpayer was that we wanted all residents to have skin in the game. So currently, what happens is if you're on the circuit breaker, essentially your school tax is capped. And so you can vote in a bigger school budget and you're not affected. So that type of a system it's addressing one problem, but it's sort of not good for democracy.
Okay, now I thought, and I'm surprised Senator McDonald is quiet. There have been studies that say that poorer towns where most people are under that circuit breaker are less likely to vote in school budgets or higher school budgets than wealthier towns. And have you come across that study?
No, actually, for the waiting task force, the highest, I looked at poverty issues, and the highest poverty, the 10%, the decile of towns with the highest poverty percentages actually had higher expenditures per pupil.
Yeah.
Then after categorical aid, they were not higher. They were sort of average. And then after weighting the pupils, turning them into equalized pupils, they were actually spending less. So in terms of the spending per equalized pupil, it's less in high poverty towns. In terms of the actual budget voted in, the actual budget per pupil is higher. So it's hard to answer your question.
Yeah, but all right, Senator McDonald is waving things at me. I cannot read it, Senator, but if you're on paper, if you email Faith what you've got, maybe she can find it for us.
I can, very short summary that the towns that have the most people at low income vote the budgets that are the lowest. And the towns that have the people with the highest incomes vote the budgets that are the highest. And this is from the Vermont Tax Department and distributed by Mark Peralt over a decade ago. But that's updating this might be helpful.
Okay, so
in our discussion.
we need to update that or trace it down just to make sure we've.
And I think it's just important to be clear as to whether you're talking total expenditures, whether you're talking, you've included categorical aid, whether you're talking spending per equalized pupil, which is the way most of the studies end up. So the last piece in terms of dealing with the taxpayers is that we didn't want to have a lag the way we have now, where if you have a sudden tax increase, you have to pay the higher property tax amount in 1 year, and you don't get your adjustment until the following year, which is causing a lot of problems in, say, Burlington now. And then we also had sort of the larger administration goals. We felt that we wanted to have a single tax. We didn't want the current combination of two taxes where you have a property tax and an income tax. You have to administer both of them. And then you have sort of a third process of trying to reconcile the two with, some are done at the local level, some are done at state level. They're on one's calendar year, one's a fiscal year, have to mesh them all together. So we wanted there to be one tax. We wanted the bill to be done, the accounting to be done in one fiscal year. Right now, what happens is you vote in a school budget in 1 year, and then we raise the taxes. We raise the property tax for that, but we don't, in that fiscal year, raise enough money to cover the adjustment that will come in the next year. We pass that on to the next fiscal year. So we wanted to pull that in and have it all done in the same fiscal year. We wanted to eliminate the issue that we're now sending, the tax department is now sending information to the towns that enables people to back into somebody's income. And it's public information. We wanted also to shift the focus from what's the fair amount for people to pay in taxes. We wanted to be, what's the fair amount for people to pay in education tax, and shifted away from the subsidy, quote, subsidy amount that people are getting. Because some people are looking at the credit as a subsidy and saying that, well, that person shouldn't get more of a subsidy than another person. And the reason is that they've paid more in the first place. So we just like to make it clear about, you can compare what people pay, and that should be fair rather than focusing on a subsidy. We felt we wanted to keep the local control of school budgets and the tax rate. We didn't want to shift to a single school district model. And we wanted to keep the equity between districts and taxpayers that we currently have because of the Brigham decision. And that is through using the yield concept. And I've found after making this recommendation, we got so many people asking, but how could it be Brigham compliant if you change to income or something like that, change to tax base? As if the only way we were Brigham compliant was had something to do with the house site tax. I began to realize that people weren't totally clear on what had happened when we switched to the yield. And so I'd like to, a 2-minute summary, which is that at the time of the Brigham decision, there was a wide disparity in property wealth per pupil. And some districts needed a tax rate that would be 10 times higher to raise the same amount per pupil as another district. And we, as in most states, addressed it by simply giving some state aid to sort of prop up the lower property wealth districts. And so we were doing this, but at the time of the Brigham decision, the court found that the disparity between property wealth was creating tax rate differences that were too extreme, and that we needed to provide a substantially equal access to resources. So we switched, and the first part is pretty obvious, which we took the non-residential property, and that's subject to the same rate everywhere. It goes into the education fund. We set up the education fund with that, and then along with some other state taxes. And then we set up this process of allowing each district to access that fund along with the amount that they were willing to raise on their homestead property. And essentially, if we set a yield, but if you think about it, what we've really done is, so this year the yield was $11,137. Okay, so that would give you, you could raise that amount per pupil with a rate of $1 on your homestead property. So what that's the equivalent of is saying that behind each student, no matter what district you're in, we're guaranteeing that you can set your rate as if you had 1,131, I'm sorry, $1,131,700 in property tax base everywhere. And clearly you don't. So clearly there's some towns when they raise their homestead tax, they pay into the ed fund much less than another town does for the same spending per pupil, but they get the same amount out. It's as if we didn't prop up one town or the other necessarily. We gave them all the same tax base per pupil. Okay, so you could do that same thing with any tax base, essentially, if you guaranteed a yield. All right, so then our first, going through that whole list of things that we were striving for, our first discussion was really, if we go to a single tax base, we know we're going to do the yield, but what tax base is it going to be? And basically we were looking at the obvious choices of property or income. And you just had this discussion basically about is residential property or your house a good proxy for your ability to pay? Or maybe I should actually go back a step to say we wanted a single tax and we wanted it related to the ability to pay. We thought that the ability to pay didn't necessarily mean income. It would be a mix of income and assets. Okay, so that's why we're sort of looking at both the property tax and the income tax. And we're looking at it, is there a way to get a better fix on ability to pay that is a different combination of income and assets?
Deb, one question. You said property and income and assets. Now they show up with their, rebated property tax sitting on their porch in front of their $500,000 condo. Happens every couple years, makes the front page because once you bought your condo and your Porsche, you can live fairly comfortably on $89,000 a year. You have simple taste. So how do we get at assets? I've got a $20 million trust fund, but I'm choosing to live simply. And so I'm drawing down very little income, but I have those assets. And as opposed to the person that sells the family camp to pay off their medical bills, and they end up in that wealth category for 1 year. So how did you deal with assets?
We spent a lot of time and got nowhere, essentially. There is, we don't have a data source. So we don't have a good fix on this. There is a national survey that's done of people and of family income. And essentially, one of the things that they do is they look at net worth. And if you arrange them into quintiles, for example, you find that at the low end of net worth, a house exceeds your total net worth because you have very little other than the house, and the value of the house is higher than your net worth because it's mortgaged. Okay, and then at the very high end, a house is only 14% of the net worth. So, the rest is, a lot of it is financial assets. But basically, it was clear to us that a house value is not a good proxy for ability to pay. We felt that we definitely need a better fix on other assets, but we simply don't have it now. So, after lots of analysis of things indicating that there are other pieces to wealth, to ability to pay, we were unable to get enough data to suggest.
Okay, I think Senator Pearson has a question.
As much as I would love to entertain a straight up wealth tax, my understanding is no state's really in a good position to do it.
Right.
A lot of people say the federal government's not even in a good place to do it because the very wealthy can hide their assets. But so I sort of, not that I've given up, but I've moved on from hoping that we could tax wealth in that sense. But the wealthy that don't have a ton of annual income, they by and large are probably living on investments, if it's a trust fund or whatever. And my question is, capital gains, we treat unlike regular income, but not entirely. And I'm curious, in your proposal, Deb, does the tax, the income surcharge that pays for schools, does that come before or after the capital gains exclusion?
Okay, so another question is, if you decide to go to income, what income number do you use? Right now we use household income, and I think it's like 30 questions or something like that. There's all the stuff you have to fill out. We were looking for simplicity. We were looking for something that you would have in your head when you went to school meeting. You'd have some idea of how this was going to affect you. So we opted for AGI. So AGI is the very front thing in your income tax form. Okay, so it's pretty much before any of the other deductions.
I thought the adjusted part of it was because it was after those deductions, but you're saying it's the big number in that sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe Senator Brock can tell us exactly what's
You've
deducted from
answered.
AGI.
That gives me a sense, but thanks.
There's a few federal deductions that come out ahead of that. Senator Bray.
Well, I just wanted to double back to Senator Pearson's comment on capital gains. I mean, I don't know if anyone does this, but it is never quite made sense to me that they're not indexed for inflation, because you may have had no actual gain in value, but you could have a loss, but it would nominally appear as a gain because inflation outpaced the rate of growth of that asset. So I've never quite understood why we don't do that.
All right, that I think is another issue. If we
Leave it
get to
alone.
this and we start looking at capital gains, we'll get down into those weeds. Okay, let's stay with property and income tax.
Okay, these are the kinds of questions that come up, though. So defining what we would use for income is a question as well. And let's see, we did in the process, before we went to income, we looked at total property and said, okay, if we wanted to use the single tax base being property tax, we could offer a very substantial house site deduction to everyone. It could be $60,000 to $70,000. You subtract that amount from your house site value, and then you pay the property tax on the rest. So if you had a lower value house, that deduction would be substantial, a much higher proportion of your total bill than if you had a million house, for example. So in that sense, you would think that it would be progressive. But we found out that because the initial distribution of house value by income is so skewed. In other words, house value is way higher than your income at the low end of income. And when you get all the way up at the high end, your house value may be the same as your income. So in that sense, even if you chop the legs out, you still have that same graph in terms of that tax rate, that it's a much higher percentage of the income of low income households than high income households. So in order to make it less regressive, we would have to overlay it with some sort of income screen. So we'd be back to having the two systems again. So we rejected that option and went to the income base. And I also didn't point out, I guess I know you asked Saoirse this question, or somebody did, but we were unanimous. We didn't have a minority opinion. Everyone agreed on the recommendations that we put forward in the report. And of course, as we dove into questions, like say capital gains, things would start to get more complicated. We all agreed to everything that we put in the report. And so, but basically the bottom line was we looked at sort of 6 alternative models. We wanted a better indication of ability to pay that somehow included assets and income. We couldn't find it. So we decided to go out with the single tax would be on income. It would be a direct income-based tax. It would depend on local spending per pupil. So there'd be a different rate in every town. There'd be no adjustment credit kind of system, would happen in the same year. Eventually, we wanted to include renters to also pay the education tax the same way. We couldn't find any principle-based reason to treat the way you deal with education tax differently, depending on whether you owned your house or whether you rented. At the current time, we don't have enough information to be able to implement that change. We wanted to couple it with a credit to renters in recognition that when they're renting, the rental unit is paying school tax. So essentially, they are also. And then all other property except for the primary residence and the 2 acres would be taxed at a single rate, no matter who owns it. Okay, so we're just substituting a tax on income for the tax on the house and 2 acres. And so quickly, sort of how this would work for, let's say right now, people are thinking about they're pulling together their income for 2021. And that's the income that we'd be basing the school tax on, the one that you're about ready to file. At the same time, the school board has calculated their budget, and the December letter or something equivalent has come out giving an estimate of what the income yield is going to be for that year. So the school board can take their budget, divide by the pupils, and come up with, divide that by the yield and come up with a tentative income rate, so that at the school meeting, voters can see the connection between their vote and their bill, have a good idea of what they're going to have to pay if they vote in that budget. And they would also know that if the budget increases, their rate goes up. And if the budget goes down, their rate goes down.
Yeah.
Then the district has a vote, and let's say the budget passes, the spending per pupil is sent to the tax department. The legislature then sets the final yield, let's say April. The non-residential bills go out as usual from the town to the taxpayers, but the town doesn't send out homestead education bills. So there's no separate rate for homestead property. There's just one rate that the town uses for education. And the tax department would send a notice to residents, let's say it's sometime in the summer, saying they have their income and then they have the town rate and say, this would be your total bill. And then also let them know, we wanted them to be able to pay in installments or throughout the year, as opposed to just this one lump sum, which is a problem with some property tax bills now. So anyway, that when the tax department let them know of the total bill, could also let them know about whether it's estimated payments or installment payments or however would be made during the year. And then there would be a final payment maybe in April of next year. Okay.
So is there going to be, I'm going to file my state income tax, right? I'm thinking through Brigham. Is what you're going to do, figure out how much the school budget, what schools are going to vote. You're going to look at the total income of the state. You're going to, and then, but that income is going to get paid into the ed fund, and then it will be distributed, prorated for the budget in the town. Because there are wealthier towns, there are towns with no money.
Okay.
Everybody's, okay.
It's exactly the same thing that we do now. And, I'd like
Okay.
to make it sound like it's like really complicated higher math, but it isn't. We just essentially do a weighted average. So when we figure out the spending per pupil in each of the districts, then we weight their tax base based on that amount because they're going to bring in more or less. Okay. So in other words, a high spending district will weight their spending 125% of average. We're going to look at their tax base and bring it in 125% of the
Their
more.
tax being the wealth of their community.
Yeah. So right now it's house site value, and then it would change to AGI. It would be the same process.
Okay. I want to see it. I need a flow chart.
A flow chart. Okay. I'll give you some file cards.
I like diagrams. Okay, Senator, I'm a visual learner. Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Deb. What happens if you move midway through the year? If a homeowner moves?
First,
Well, I think we have to set up the rules as to when are you a resident to qualify for this and when are you not. But once the a tax bill has gone out, then it has to be paid, even if you move out. And right now we leave it between the buyer and the seller to figure out how they're going to split it up. You could
It
do the
is
same thing.
standardly prorated by day. Trust me, I've done it. And you pay up until the day of closing, and then the buyer picks it up. But if there is a significant, and there is trouble, if you didn't work in Vermont last year, that we don't have your income records and you're not going to qualify, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're buying the house, the assumption is you have the wealth to purchase the house, and therefore you should be able to pay the taxes. The mortgage companies figure that out. If I buy a house and I am elderly and I'm downsizing, and so I spend my money on the house, my income, I'm going to pay on my income, which would be significantly less once I've used my asset to buy the house. I need a diagram.
I think that the question becomes more awkward, or has become really awkward with our current system, because the credit isn't coming during the same year. And so no one can figure out who owns the credit. Like, it's
Oh, the
basically
credit goes to the seller when you change,
well, it's interesting.
or
I
sometimes
asked,
it's prorated.
right, I asked the Bar Association what they were doing, and I got a million answers back.
It depends on who you ask.
Yeah, that's for sure. But anyway, I think this would be simpler, except for that. The bottom line is it's all in 1 year, so that's simpler. You don't have to worry about a credit coming in another year, and and the tax bill has to be paid, so the buyer and the seller have to figure out how they're going to prorate it.
Okay.
Okay.
It would be helpful for me to see runs on this, because I think we know that we kill ourselves trying to stop any kind of sudden up or down in your education tax. And I'm wondering how many ups and downs, if you're going to set the rate somewhere near where the rate is now, then those making 90,000 or less shouldn't see a major change. But we could see some major changes above 90,000, which are not particularly wealthy people. Are the people, yeah, they are not in this day. I mean, I wouldn't put a dog in a house I'd spent $90,000 for in Montpelier if I could find one. It wouldn't have running water or a functioning roof. And it probably would have a septic that backed up. So, I'm just, yeah, I need to see the impact.
Okay, I put together sort of a comparison by category of adjusted gross income of what people are paying now and what they would pay, and the value of their house, and what they paid, the gross tax, property tax, the net after the credit, and then what would happen if we switched to this system. And that's what I'm sort of hoping to get Catherine, Julia, to look at before I hand it out, but I'll get that to you.
Okay, so that's the agenda. I am looking for handouts. Okay. Okay, I don't have any handouts for today, so we don't have anything that you've put together to work on this.
Well, I did put together some charts that I could briefly show you, but I think we've covered most of the information except for this next one I'm going to get to.
Okay.
But it mainly had to do with house values, property taxes, and their relationship to income, and sort of why we went to income as the tax. But the two big issues that are much harder to deal with are volatility and sort of economic competitiveness, or what this will do. Your tax capacity question, what this will do to upper income people.
Blue Ribbon Tax Commission's concern is that competitiveness.
Yeah. So for volatility, people have in their minds, that the income tax is a very volatile tax, and that the property tax is a really stable tax. And so shifting the tax base was a big concern. Everybody brought up volatility as a concern. So we spent a lot of time looking at it. And it's clear that if you use AGI as a tax base, you've got a much higher reliance on high income people than if you use, say, the property tax. So let's see, house sites, the top 5% of house sites accounted for 14% of our total house site base. But if you look at the top 5% of AGI, it's much more. It's more like 30% of the tax base. And so we were concerned about that. And we looked at an analysis of the two tax bases, AGI versus the Equalized Education Grand List over time. And we found out that there wasn't that much difference. Actually, AGI was more stable in the years that we could look at it. I wouldn't consider it that way, but at least it wasn't more volatile. But yet we wanted to reduce volatility. And so these are some ways that we thought of. The first is that one of the reasons the property tax is so stable is that we figure out how much money we need, and then we set a rate to come up with the right amount. Okay, so the income tax, on the other hand, the rates, we have the rates already, and we set our budget and hope that we come in with the right amount. So that's a very different process. So in this, in our recommendation, we would set the yield to come in with the right amount. The second is that we would base the tax on the income from the year that's just finished, rather than basing it on the year that hasn't happened yet. So even though people may not have, we don't have all the filings complete and that sort of stuff, we at least know whether a pandemic has happened or not. So we have a much better idea of what the income base is. And then also, it's different from, this would be different from the volatility of the personal income tax because there are no brackets. So if you think about it, if you say that the biggest variation is in sort of in the high end where there may be a big capital gain or not, and that's the most volatile part. The income tax, because it's a higher bracket, puts a much higher importance on the high income. This would be flat so that there's less, it reduces that volatility. It also, incidentally, reduces that problem for the person who suddenly sells their business and gets all their gain in 1 year when it's supposed to be their retirement. So it's a problem in the income tax when it bumps you into a higher bracket. But in this tax, it would be just the same as if you got it in over 20 years. Basically, you're paying the same amount. You're not bumped up into a high bracket 1 year. And the commission ended up not recommending this, but you could further reduce the reliance on top incomes by capping the maximum income amount, as we do in Social Security. So basically saying that an income of, let's say, $1 million would be the maximum that we would put this school tax on. So if your income were higher than that, you'd pay a school tax based on an income of $1 million or whatever the cap is. The commission didn't recommend that, but we did consider it as a tool to reduce volatility and to get at the other question of how much tax capacity is there at the high end. And the final thing is, we recommend using a stabilization reserve to actually stabilize taxes. Right now we have a stabilization reserve, but we just use it pretty much. We set the limits so that it's used for our bond rating and is not used to stabilize. And
we have a reserve in the Ed fund
yes,
to stabilize, to be used to help stabilize rates.
yeah, but we aren't allowed to, the statute sets an upper limit, so that you can't, for example, say, oh, we got a windfall this year, but it's going to make a big jump next year. Maybe we want to keep a little in reserve to
But we
make
can
it for the
change
next,
that.
right. So, but that's the point, would be that we could use a stabilization reserve to actually stabilize taxes if we wanted to.
What, did you do a transition at all? Because I'm thinking if I'm got a $500,000 house and I've been paying taxes on that, but I have a business and assets and I've got millions in income, there's going to be quite a jump in there. I mean,
So no, we haven't worked on the transition yet,
okay. Because
or I
there's
haven't.
got to be some people to, if we're going to, do I understand the goal is to lower taxes on less wealthy people? Or are we going to hold them flat?
The goal was not necessarily to lower, or maybe I should say this. We were just taking the system as a whole and trying to make it more fair. And so we set the tax rates to come out with the same amount of money to compare to current law. If you wanted to change it so that we've lowered taxes on some, that would,
Well,
or
I
change the
can't
school
see,
rate
if
or
you're
whatever,
going
but
to be collecting a whole lot more from wealthier people, then we're either going, I mean, what happens to that whole lot more? We're either going to spend it on education or we're going to use it to lower the tax rate
Right.
on less wealthy people.
right. And so that's what happens is
Okay,
we
so
assume
that's
that,
what we are going to do. I got a question from Senator Hardy.
Well, two things. One, I think, Deb, it would be helpful if you walked us through these charts, especially since they're visual representations of some of the things you talked about, and that may be helpful. And I've seen Senator Brock and I have seen these charts before, but the other thing, I think Senator Cummings, that the goal, as Deb was saying, wasn't to raise more taxes from wealthy people. It was to raise the same amount of money that we currently spend on education, but just using a different type of tax. And in fact, if I understand it correctly, the proposal, it would be a flat tax regardless of income. So that it wouldn't be a
Okay, but
higher
if we're-
tax on wealthier people, at least as it's
No,
proposed.
it would be, it will in all probability be a much higher tax payment from wealthier people.
Probably, depending
And
on
I
the
think
value of their home.
there is sticker shock here. And I think that's the run I'd like to see, if you know, how that payment, how it shifts and where it goes. And I guess I'd like to see how it goes now too, so we have those to compare.
Yeah.
Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Deb. What's the impact for people with a homestead, you know, where they're carving up their acreage and paying a little bit on their home site? Can you just remind us of the proposal's impact there?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, if you have a big parcel, maybe I'm getting confused with current use and stuff, but if you have a big parcel, you consider your home site, which is sort of the 2 acres that includes your home, and that's for schools. You pay a little bit one way there, and then on the rest of your land, you pay it a different way. And I remember years ago that there were folks that considered the shift in income to be quite beneficial, or have a sort of make it a little more straightforward for people with a significant amount of land where this was the case, but admittedly, I'm pretty foggy on it. So maybe I'm not asking a coherent question.
Well, we used to, so the current use program and Act 60 happened at different times, so they had different rules for a while. We had a really hard time trying to figure out how, for current use, you have to exclude 2 acres around your dwelling. And so now we've made that 2-acre exclusion the same, defined the same way, appraised the same way for current use as for your education tax in general. So it's the first 2 acres in the parcel. It's the most valuable 2 acres. At one point for current use, it used to be averaged so that it made your land value seem higher and your house site value seem lower, but now they're the same. So there's not a conflict.
Okay, Deb, without
part.
getting into current use, I have 9 acres. And it's goes straight up, pretty difficult to access, but it's behind my house. I pay in my home site. All right, so am I going to pay my income tax, if I heard you correctly, would be on my homestead, my house and 2 acres? Well, how would I pay on the remaining 7 acres?
So you pay the non-residential rate.
I would
Same as
pay
you do today?
non-residential rate.
Right. But your most of your value is going to be on your first 2 acres, your house and your first 2 acres. In other words, the listers will continue to value your parcel the same way with the same rules. And so basically the first 2 acres are the most valuable. They'll subtract that. And then the remainder is non-residential. And then you pay the non-residential rate on that.
Isn't that the same way we do it today?
That
Yes.
is the same way we do it today, but
Yes.
now I would be paying on my income on my house and 2 acres.
But the remaining acres would be paid the same as they are done today.
I'm
Right.
probably going to do real well because we're pretty much on a fixed income
The
around
same
here.
as they are today.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay, no change in the acres.
Well,
above
yeah,
2
now
acres.
I'm paying on the value of my house,
Right.
but I'm a senior citizen. So now I'm going to be paying on my income. I could not afford to buy my house today. I think you'd find most senior citizens would say that. So I'm going to theoretically pay a lot less because my income in relation to my house is, the value of my house is lower. Is that,
So actually,
No different.
that's
than-
probably the same that you're paying now.
The same as it is
Over
today.
not if
over
I'm
2 years.
making $91,000.
Okay, but let's just say for most people, let's say somebody making $89,000 and has a house value less than $400,000, they're ending up paying on income. They
On their
first they
house.
pay on their
Yeah.
house value, and then the next year they get a credit. That's the difference between what they should have paid on income and what they paid on the house value.
Right.
So
That's
in
it.
the end, this isn't that different for people who are sort of in that, they're under the caps and they're less than 100. Well, it's not different for people less than $90,000 in general.
Madam
It's
Chair,
just, it happens in 1 year and it's
that's,
clear.
we're conflating 2 questions. You pay your house and 2 acres today differently than you pay the remaining acres.
Right.
And if you
Different
change to
rate.
income, you will be paying the house and 2 acres differently under income as they are paid today.
Right.
And whether or not you get paid this year or next year is a separate question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Senator Pearson.
Madam Chair, I would just say your comment about particular seniors with a fixed income, the current system, I think, is problematic for people that have lived in a piece of property for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always one of the reasons I've appreciated this shift, because it is very directly, for the huge majority of people, a much clearer representation between the amount they're paying and their ability to pay. And especially if you look at the last few years, if you've lived in a house for, even my house, I've lived in this house for 14, 15 years, and it bears no resemblance, as you say, to what I could buy today. But obviously that impacts my school bill, my school tax significantly.
Senator McDonald.
And in the case that Senator Pearson just described, and that we haven't discussed this background, is that today there are several thousand Vermonters who live in such homes where the value of their home is very high, and they may not pay their property school taxes based on income, because we have in statute that if you happen to live in a really expensive house in a town like Stowe or Charlotte, you can't pay based on income, because the payment that the town receives on your behalf is limited to a dollar amount. Well, if you live in a house that's worth $1 million or $2 million in Stowe, and you go and apply to pay based on income, you will be told that your house is too valuable to be paid based on income, and we limit the amount of money that can be sent from the education fund to reduce your property taxes.
Right, yeah.
And
It's only up to 130 or 200,000, which definitely needs to be moved if we keep doing that.
If there is the amount of dollars it costs to reimburse the town for is limited. And one of the options that's open to us that I would remind the committee of, that we have chosen not to do, is that there are a substantial number of people who live in very high assessed towns who earn a lot of money and may put horses in their front yard, and may own houses that are of extremely high value. And the way we catch those people is we limit the amount of money that can be spent to reduce their property taxes when they are based on income.
Mm-hmm.
And we could, and they're very wealthy, and folks don't want to do a wealth tax, but we could, since we know who they are, say to the tax department and send them a letter and saying, you are eligible to pay based on your income, provided that you do not have money in this X, Y, Z, or whatever, whether it's this type of bonds or that type of bonds, the next type of bonds.
Okay.
And all those people need to do, if
Is
they
attest.
don't have any of that wealth, is to simply attest that they don't have any of that kind of wealth.
Okay.
And then they would be able to pay based on their income under the current system. And for those people who don't sign that waiver, they wouldn't get the big discount in their property tax bill, because they have been let us know that they have money in different forms of accounting that enable them to hide it away and not have to count it on April 15th. But we have chosen not to follow that route.
We could.
And we could also, in the letter where they attest that they don't have any of these things, we could say, and that you're subject to being audited because you have sworn you don't have any of these incomes. But that is another way to
You do
deal
something.
with the frequently mentioned problem by very wealthy people who would seek not to have us do that.
Asset rich. Okay. I'm going to have to start wrapping this up because I have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. We have a emergency board to deal with a 9 million that was supposed to be a 0.9 million Scribner's error. So we need to adjust. It should only take 10 minutes, but those little decimal points do. We did catch it before the budget was presented, but after the emergency board, it was caught. So I have to leave at 4 o'clock or a minute or two before to do that. So Deb, have you been through the basics of what you did or are proposing? Okay. And Abby, my understanding is that S212 reflects Deb's proposal, and Abby is here to walk us through 212. And maybe when we start to see it in writing, it will help to understand what we're changing and how we're doing it. And then I gather that there are now runs available to show us the changes in different groups of taxpayers. Is that right, Deb?
I'm hoping to get someone to look over my shoulder before I hand them out. So
Okay.
maybe next
But I
week.
mean,
I've
they are out there. They may not have been proofed yet, but
yeah,
they're there. Okay. So that means eventually we can see them.
right.
Okay. So Abby, you want to walk us through this?
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Abby Shepherd of Office of Legislative Counsel. Thank you, Deb, for giving all of that fantastic background, and you've actually presented a lot of what I'm going to be going over. Most of the questions you've just asked were points that I had in my notes to highlight and to go over with you. And there are some outstanding questions. The language that is in S212 as introduced does have some, I don't want to say holes, but some policy questions still sort of outstanding to
If
be
you highlight those, then we can see what we're going to do. Okay.
But I'm going to start with the first document, the high level summary. That's the 1-page summary that really goes over the main points in this bill, because it is, for a tax bill, it is quite long. Usually the bills I'm walking you through in your committee are much shorter than this. Many of these changes are conforming changes because of the breadth of what this bill does. It eliminates the property tax credit and the homestead tax. So most of the changes that you see towards the end of the bill, it's sort of front loaded at the first few pages of the bill. The rest of the bill tends to be conforming changes. So as you've just discussed, the major policy shift and tax policy shift in this bill is creating a new resident education tax. So the tax rate is the education spending of the taxpayer's school district divided by the yield. So as Deb did point out, and Senator Hardy emphasized this as well, this isn't changing the whole structure, it's changing the tax base. So the tax base would be federal adjusted gross income. So it's AGI of every Vermont resident that applies to both homeowners and renters. And that's an important point as we go through, that renters would be subject to this tax. And in this bill, there is currently no credit that's proposed. There is a new definition of the yield, but it's not dramatically different. Under current statute, there's the yield for homeowners who pay based on property value and those who pay, the majority who pay based on income. This eliminates those two, has one yield, and it's very similar to the existing yield language. It's just that it's the education tax rate. So the yield is the amount of spending per equalized pupil that would result if the resident education tax rate was 1%, and if the ed fund stabilization reserves were maintained at their statutory rate, which is 5% of the prior year's appropriations.
Can you share screen
Oh, absolutely. I'm
with
sorry.
us? I think it might be easier if we can all
Sure.
look at it rather than going back and forth here on the agenda. And I apologize. I don't know how I got into a Senate Finance through the website that didn't have today's drafts or handouts on it. I went out and came back in somehow, and there they are. So there are charts from Deb there. Okay.
Yes. So I will share my screen. You will find these if you want to follow along online under my name for S212. Let me give me just a moment. Great. So everyone should have the sort of high level 1-page summary now.
Yeah.
So I'm under the first bullet point, looking at the definition of the yield. So it is very similar to the existing statute. It's the amount that would be raised. In this case, it's the resident education tax rate at 1%. Under current statute for the homestead rate, it's $1. So it's very similar. To note, there was a question about how this would impact different taxpayers at different income levels. The bill does provide for a reduction in the tax rate for lower income filers, and it's a progressive reduction. So for single filers who have adjusted gross income of $25,000 or less, the maximum reduction would be 80% of the tax rate. And for joint filers with AGI of $50,000 or less, they would get that maximum, and then it phases out for amounts of AGI above that. Tax payments are required under the bill either by quarterly wage withholding or through quarterly estimated tax payments. And then there would be an annual reconciliation when the individual files their income tax return. So that would be at the time of filing the income tax return. And the way that taxpayers would withhold would be based on the prior year's statewide average rate for the education tax. And taxpayers would choose the rate at which they would withhold from their paycheck at 75% of the prior year's rate, 100% or 125%. All of the education tax revenues would be deposited into the education fund in the way that property tax revenues are currently. As I mentioned previously, this bill does eliminate both the homestead education property tax and the existing property tax credit. So many of the bill sections that you see are just conforming changes. So it's repealing a lot of references to the property tax credit as well as the homestead tax. The non-homestead education property tax is still imposed under this proposal in S212. And I did try and explain part of what you were just discussing about how the property tax would apply when an individual has a homestead that's greater than 2 acres. So you would subtract, you'd essentially have an exemption for the homestead and the 2 acres around that dwelling. And then anything above the 2 acres would be subject to the non-homestead property tax. So in that case, you could have an individual, take 2 different examples. You could have a homestead owner who has a property that's 1.75 acres. They would not be paying any property tax on that. They would just be paying the education tax on their income. An individual who has, say, a 9-acre property, the first 2 acres surrounding their home, their homestead, would be subtracted, and the remaining 7 acres would be subject to the non-homestead tax. And then that individual would also be paying the resident education tax.
Like it is today,
Yeah.
the way it is today.
Yes, that's not a change.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's keep going.
And another important point is that this bill does continue to provide the existing renter credit, which starting for filers right now is significantly different. That was reformed in 2020. So that has not been changed in any way. And that is one of the outstanding questions in this bill, is how to handle renters. And that brings us to the final major change under this bill, which is creating a new Education Fund Advisory Committee. So it'd be an ongoing committee to monitor the entire education funding system that would be required to report and make annual recommendations back to the General Assembly. They would take on the December 1st tax rate letter. The committee does include the Commissioner of Taxes and the Secretary of Education. So they're currently involved with the December 1st letter. It would put them on this committee and the committee would be making the recommendation. The committee does have other members in addition to the Commissioner of Taxes and Secretary of Education. It has public members with expertise in education financing. Each of the bodies of the General Assembly would appoint 2 of those individuals, and then there would be 1 public member appointed by the governor. The committee does need to report, and I'll talk about dates in just a moment, but they would need to report in their initial report back to the General Assembly with a few key points of what has not been completely ironed out in this bill. One would obviously be the first recommended education tax rates and the yield. The committee would also need to propose a new structure for the renter credit program. And this is to address those renters who may be paying both on their income, so be paying the resident education tax, and then they may also be paying rent that includes the portion of the non-homestead property tax within their rent that their landlord would be charging them. And many of the renters that would have to declare and pay the new resident education tax would not be eligible for the existing renter credit, which I won't go into great detail about all of those changes that were made in 2020, but that is based on income and family size. So this first report would particularly need to focus on those renters who are would be paying both taxes and not receiving a credit. Lastly, one of the areas that the bill did not go into great detail about or make some of the policy decisions about are penalties for late filings of the resident declaration, which is really the equivalent of the current homestead declaration, or if someone does not file. So I will pause there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
And I don't know if it makes more sense to look at each individual section of the bill or to go through some of the outstanding questions or to take questions. I open to what the committee would like to do. I do have a detailed section by section.
Yeah, I think a detailed. Senator Hardy, do you have a question?
No, I actually have a comment. I just wanted to let everybody know that the Education Fund Advisory Committee portion of this bill was actually also one of the recommendations of the Pupil Weighting Task Force, that we create that regardless of whether we do the income tax thing. The task force felt like it would be helpful overall to have this body overseeing and doing work in the interim on education finance issues, the weights, the taxes, the categorical aids, whatever it is. So.
And that work is not being done now?
Not regularly. There is a process for doing the December 1 memo, but that's kind of all there is. And so this would expand that to have more attention paid by people who understand the system into updating parts of the system, whether, like I said, whether it's the weights, whether it's the rates, whether it's the penalties, whatever it is. So that was part of the task force recommendations as well.
Okay. So committee, where would you like to go next? Or is this just so new? We need time. Senator Pearson.
Well, I'm curious. Ms. Brighton said that JFO was. I don't know where to direct or ask Abby to go. But so I have a sort of separate question, which is JFO's schedule. Do we have a sense of when they're able to help us get those runs? Because I agree with you, Madam Chair. That's sort of starting to put meat on whether or not this
Yeah.
can advance or our speed and all that.
Okay, and I don't know. We all know we lost Mark, and Mark staffed most of the waiting study and was our 20-year, well, he staffed, I understood, a lot of the property tax stuff that
He
he was,
staffed it until he left. And
Yeah,
so
until he
he did
left.
about half of it and then he left.
and so we've lost our long memory there. And we are, I see Julia, we've got new folks that, there's Julia. You popped over to the other side. New folks that are working their way through this, but Deb, we know Deb hasn't had someone from JFO able to sit down and just kind of proof out the runs. And so what I can do is perhaps, Julia, you can ask Catherine to let us know what kind of a time frame you think they can get that done in.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'll reach out to Catherine and have some offline discussions with Deb and our little ed finance team as we're all trying to get up to speed on this big proposal and get back to the committee.
And our lead on the ed finance is home doing childcare so his wife can recover from COVID. But he is working during naps and in the evening, so maybe he can take a look at the runs during those times. He's just, at least for this week, we're hoping next week everything's back to normal. Maybe he can, this is something he can do in his spare time. As all parents of young children know, they have tons of. So do you want to have Abby just walk us through a section by section? And then we've got the last thing on the agenda is that overpayment of property tax. The Barry bill that Abby has done, right? Yes, has done a new drafting, taking in all the feedback from the auditor and that is the last thing on our agenda, but that would put us a whole half hour ahead. I don't know that I can do that. But I'm looking at faces and I don't see anyone on Friday afternoon that's really ready to delve into this on an in-depth, word for word basis. This isn't new system. We've all been grappling with understanding the old system. Now we're grappling with this one. And the first question for me is this a simpler, fairer system? And I think Deb has given us some charts. We can look at those. We can see how quickly we can get the runs in. Because that for me is where I see, well, all right, we've got these, credits that are going to go to people in this income bracket. I need to see how that works out. And then I think we need to give people time to look at it. I think we need to, once we have everything, make sure that the tax department comes in and talks to us. And we're dealing with property tax, so we're going to have to hear from the town clerks and see how, because at one point they were really thrilled to have the state take over the collection. And then they figured out what it was going to cost them and they weren't as thrilled as having the state. So
Cost them meaning,
pardon?
when you say what was going to cost them,
they get paid for processing the state education. They get so much per parcel. All right, I knew. the teacher is watching. And
Anything,
that would have to work out too, but I think we'd need to hear from them.
and collections, who would earn the money from collecting delinquent taxes?
That's the other question we're going to want to hear from the clerks on. Because this would essentially put the homestead property tax collection into the tax department, and it would be paid on an installment or annually, I guess. It could be done on an income deduction, but that would take something from your employer. So there's some things to be worked out there. I personally have always said the reason we get so many complaints about the property tax and not about income or your credit card payments, if you ever add up the interest that gets paid on credit cards, is because you pay them off in monthly installments. If you ever had to pay your credit card or your credit card interest payments off once a year, you'd probably scream. And the same with your income tax. And so anything we can do to kind of spread that tax out will make it easier, no matter what basis we charge it on. If you can make it more than, I think the most is 4 times a year. Montpelier does it in quarters, but some towns still do it annually. Other towns do it twice a year, and some of them give you a credit if you pay it all at once. Or a discount if you pay it, at least they used to. They may not anymore, but we are messing in the town clerk's territory, and I do that judiciously. Senator Hardy.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Abby, you have sort of 3 things, the overview you just went over, then the bill itself, which is obviously the most detail, and then an interim one. Do you think it would be helpful to go through that interim one, or is that just going to be
what we're talking about?
Yeah,
Because-
if you'd like, I can do this section by section rather than it's a 46-page bill. I do go through every section and summarize what it's doing. So I think this section by section would probably be the most
Okay,
efficient.
why don't we do that, and then we've been through it. If we can do that in, again, fairly quickly, because I think we're going to need more information and time to process it before we start getting into wordsmithing and tweaking.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I will share my screen then. Give me just a moment. Okay, I can't see you, so I hope you can see my screen.
We can see your
this
screen,
is-
and again, I
Excellent.
can't see anybody either, so holler if you have a question.
Okay, so this is the section by section for the bill as introduced. And the first section is really just a technical change. It's to eliminate the word property from the title of the chapter, so that it says education taxes instead of education property tax, because it inserts this new resident education tax into that chapter. I've kept the bill as chronological in terms of the statutes as much as possible, but there are some subdivision headings with the asterisk, so that you can situate yourselves in the bill. I start with education taxes, and then I move into the Ed Fund Advisory Committee, Education Fund, Renter Credit, and then the end of the bill is a series of repeals. So in the very first real substantive section, it's section 2. This is the section of statute that has all of the property tax definitions in it. It makes one change that then creates a whole bunch of other changes throughout the bill, which is to strike the reference to tax for the equalized property grand list. It just removes the word tax, because it will no longer just be the property tax grand list, it will have both homestead and non-homestead properties in it. So that is one, when you're talking about municipal responsibilities, they will still be appraising, listing all properties and creating the grand list, both for homestead and non-homestead. So this does not change that process. This also importantly changes the definition of homestead, and you had the perfect setup for this change. Your discussion earlier about current use versus property tax and the property tax credit. The homestead definition as it is currently for determining a homestead property does not make any reference to the 2 acres. That 2 acre piece is for the property tax credit. So what the bill does is it repeals the property tax credit definition and puts it into the overarching definitions relating to homestead. So it would make a homestead the dwelling and the 2 acres surrounding each dwelling. And it also pulls in some other language from the property tax credit, which is being repealed from that chapter, and putting it in here about the treatment of cooperatives and mobile home park cooperatives. The definitions for education spending adjustment, dollar equivalent yield, and income dollar equivalent yield, so that's the property and the income yields, are all repealed. And that's because there's no longer the property tax credit, it's now the resident education tax rate calculation. As I mentioned before, there is a new yield definition, and this is language that was in the summary that we went over earlier. The yield means the amount of spending per equalized pupil that would result if this new resident education tax rate was 1%, and if the ed fund reserves were maintained at their statutory amount, which is 5%. So that's in the definition section. There are a few other changes. If you're looking at the language, again, there are more conforming changes to remove references to homestead property tax or to the property tax credit. And then again, a lot of changes when it's talking about the grand list. Anytime there was mention of property tax grand list, the word tax is being repealed. In section 5402, this is the rate section. So one clarifying change that was made in here is to the non-homestead tax rate. And that is just clarifying that the rate is $100 per equalized education property value. And also that that's unless otherwise set by the General Assembly. That's no change to current law. It's just putting it all into the same section. This rate section has the important repeal of the homestead tax rate. It adds in language it repeals language relating to interim homestead tax rates for school districts when they haven't voted their budgets by June 30th. And then it adds that language into the new residential education rate. Also repealed is the current requirement for the Commissioner of Taxes to determine a homestead tax rate for union or unified union school districts. The language again is added into the new resident education tax rate section. Some of this language might need a little bit of tweaking. Some of the technical parts of this don't all line up mathematically, but I won't go into that much detail here. There is one fee that's repealed. I mentioned that this bill doesn't really address a lot of the penalties and fees. However, this one fee that currently goes to towns to cover the cost of issuing a new property tax bill is repealed, because that particular fee was for late property tax credit claims. So that's something that would need to be addressed by the new Ed Fund Advisory Committee. Is what are the penalties? What are the appropriate penalties to charge for late or non-filed declarations? Where I think a lot of questions are going to come up, and where there's probably still work to be done in ironing out a lot of your questions and a lot of the details for this new tax. A lot of those questions can really focus on this section 4. That's the section that creates this new resident education tax. And this is the language that I just walked you through in the high level summary, but just a few main points. Again, the tax rate is still influenced, it's still determined by the education spending of the taxpayer school district. It's divided by the yield. Then that rate is applied to federal adjusted gross income. So it's each Vermont resident, both homeowners and renters. One thought, one sort of legal perspective, one additional change that you might wish to make is to, just based on your discussions now, is potentially moving the tax base to taxable income instead of federal adjusted gross income. That's a pretty big policy decision. This using federal adjusted gross income is not going to pull in any standard deductions, personal exemptions, any of those adjustments that happen for Vermont taxpayers' income tax liability. So that's just one policy thing to keep in mind. As I mentioned, creates a new yield. There is a reduction that phases out, but for lower income earners, the tax rate is allowed to be reduced up to 80% for individuals who have $25,000 or less if they're single filers, or $50,000 of AGI or less. Again, as we mentioned, the structure for receiving the payments, an individual can either have withholding from their wages, or if they are self-employed, for example, they would pay estimated tax payments, how they do for income tax. And then this will be followed up by an annual filing at the same time as filing the income tax return. Withholding would be at a elective rate. So the taxpayer, like how with the W-4, an individual just tells their employer how much to withhold. This bill does require employers to withhold at an amount that the taxpayer chooses. So it's either 75, 100%, or 125% of the prior year's statewide average tax rate. Again, all of these tax revenues go into the education fund. And then here, as I was mentioning in the previous section, a couple of technical, not technicals, these are important for school districts that haven't voted their budgets by June 30th. There's some language in there about how to set that tax rate. And as well, there's language about setting a tax rate for taxpayers who are, or towns who are part of more than one school district. I'm going to just keep going in interest of time, but if there are any questions, please do interrupt me. I just can't see anyone, so I'm just going by what I hear. In section 6, again, we have some conforming changes. It's repealing references to the tax grand list, property tax grand list. It's now just the property grand list. This clarifies, as part of the discussion that was had earlier, that if a homestead is on a parcel of 2 acres or less, the entire parcel will be homestead property, so it will not be subject to the non-homestead property tax. But for the portion of a property that is over 2 acres, the non-homestead property tax only applies to that amount over 2 acres. The next two sections are, again, repealing references to tax when referring to the grand list. There is an important change here. It just clarifies in section 5404A of Title 32, that's section 7 of the bill. Municipalities that have a TIF district will be collecting property taxes on non-homestead properties only. Section 8, again, repeals references to tax when referring to the grand list. And then there are some clarity that may need some more work about the types of values that the Commissioner of Taxes has to report to towns, as well as what has to be provided on property tax bills. There's language put in a few years ago requiring an explanation of the homestead tax rate. This changes it so that the Commissioner would need to provide language to towns for the new resident education tax. Section 9 of the bill adds the common level of appraisal to the list of values that the Director of PVR has to report to the town clerks and to the Secretary of Education by certain dates each year. So these are some existing reports that just add other values that need to be reported. In section 10, the duties of municipalities are amended slightly. It clarifies again that the collection of the property tax is only for non-homestead tax. It also repeals a section relating to the homestead property tax overpayment offset, where if an individual is overpaid, that can be used against an income tax liability. That language is added into the resident education tax sections. So it's just shifting. It's a lot of, as I said, conforming changes. So shifting a lot of provisions that currently exist to homestead property tax to this new resident education tax. Section 5410 in section 11 of the bill, it keeps the existing language around the homestead declaration, but renames it and applies it to the resident education tax. So it will now be called the Resident Declaration of Domicile. What is a definite change in policy is that rather than just homestead owners declaring domicile, all Vermont residents, so that includes renters, will be required to declare domicile for purposes of the education taxes. It does remove reference to the homestead tax for late filing penalties, and it clarifies what happens if an individual fails to declare the domicile. Does not provide for a new penalty, but which is something that the Education Fund Advisory Committee may need to consider. It does require the Commissioner of Taxes to determine the individual's tax liability under the resident education tax and bill that taxpayer. The Education Fund Advisory Committee. So I'm just going to pause because that's the bulk of the new tax and the new structure. The next few sections are about the committee.
Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, keep going.
Okay. Great.
It's going to take a while before we have a grasp enough to ask questions.
Sure, and I'm trying to just point out.
We can probably grasp an advisory committee.
Yes, so this is a little simpler and really creating a new, I don't know, oversight, but more of a monitoring function. After the Tax Structure Commission's work, this would sort of continue that examining of from the big picture, but also really in the weeds about both overall recommendations annually, but also what the tax rate should be set at. So it shifts the Commissioner of Taxes December 1st letter responsibilities to this committee instead of just the Department of Taxes. Granted, under current statute, the Commissioner is required to consult with the Secretary of Administration and JFO, but this shifts it to the Ed Fund Advisory Committee. Also, as I mentioned, the committee is required to report in this language, it's on or before January 15th of next year to the money committees, education committees, Ways and Means and Education, and Senate Finance and Education in the Senate. It would be a recommendation for the first tax rates and the yield under the resident education tax. Any recommendations to restructure the existing renter credit program, and then of course penalties, and then any other recommendations that the committee thinks are important to make. The next few sections are a lot of cleanup in the what's currently the homestead property tax credit and renter credit chapter 151 of Title 32. A lot of the changes are repealing reference to the property tax credit. One important note here is in section 16 of the bill. This did come up in your discussion today. I believe Senator Pearson, you mentioned what would happen if there were a transfer. Because the new resident education tax follows the income, that's the base, it would in theory follow the seller. But I mean, both individuals, if they were already Vermont residents, would be paying this. There is sort of an outstanding question of what the appropriate rate would be if the individual is either moving out of the state or moving to a different town with a different school district and a different tax rate. So that's a level of detail that the bill doesn't go into. It doesn't really address that currently. So most of these sections are just removing any reference to the property tax credit and any language stating that a certain section only applies to the renter credit. So it's really, this just becomes the renter credit chapter. The next sections, starting with section 22 of the bill, relate to the education fund. So again, it's repealing references to the homestead tax rate, replacing that with resident education tax rate, removing references to tax from the equalized grand list. Another important point is that it clarifies that the stabilization reserve, which is the reserve that's 5% of the prior year's appropriations from the Ed Fund, that the Education Fund Advisory Committee will be reviewing that reserve annually. So it's giving them another sort of oversight role in the Ed Fund system. I'm skipping over some sections here. Because again, they're conforming changes, but in section 26 of the bill, There was a policy decision made there for the tax treatment of unorganized towns and GORs. And it applies a 2% resident education tax rate to those towns. And it repeals any references to property tax credit.
Okay.
That is the bulk of the policy changes. The next few sections, I've listed out everything that's been repealed. Just in case there's any confusion there are veterans exemptions that are repealed because those are only apply to homesteads. So those were taken out because homesteads will no longer be subject to property tax. So there are a lot of repeals that are being made there. And then sections 28 to 32 of the bill are other cross references throughout Title 32 to either the homestead declaration or the homestead tax or the property tax credit. Important dates in section 33 of the bill is that only really this effective date section and the Ed Fund Advisory Committee take effect on passage. All of the big structural changes take effect in 1 year. So it would be July 1st, 2023, with the understanding that the Ed Fund Advisory Committee would be coming back with recommendations next session, and that would give the legislature time to make any changes before the property tax structure took effect July 1st, 2023. And that is the end
That's
of
it.
the section by section.
Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, if not, I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break. Before we come back, well, Abby, rest your voice and get a glass of water or something. And we'll see if we can't do that property tax overpayment bill and then be on our way. Okay. So take a 5-minute break. Faith,